In round 8 of the Tata Steel Masters, Shakhriyar Mamedyarov had the white pieces and he was playing against Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa with the black pieces, and we saw a super sharp opening on the board, really interesting stuff. And if you love a daily chess video, do hit subscribe to never miss a future video. So after c4, e5, we had pawn to g3 and pawn to c6 here from Pragg. A bit of a sideline, but okay, perfectly respectable. And now d4 from Shak, so he immediately strikes at the centre here. If black captured, then the pawn can retake, and you're quite comfortable sitting the queen here because there's no knight to c6. So instead of this, Pragg kicks on with pawn to e4, and now queen to a4 from Shak. Really interesting stuff. So we had pawn to d5 from Pragg. He takes up the fight here, pushes into the centre. We had captures, and now you can't recapture like this, of course, because of the pin. So bishop d7 is possible here. Peter's Fiddler talked about this on the Chess24 stream. You could capture this pawn. There's even lines with d6 here. But okay, we didn't see bishop to d7. Pragg played pawn to b5. Really sharp stuff. So it kicks the queen back, and now black has to find a follow-up. You don't want to be taking this pawn like this, or the queen captures here with check. This is bad. If you take with the queen, this equally isn't a good pawn structure. Knight c3 could come, and even after bishop b4, e3 is nice. These pawns are just a bit vulnerable, as we can see. So coming back here, we didn't have this line. After queen b3, Pragg goes knight to f6, preparing to recapture that pawn with the knight. And now you don't take here as white because you're just helping black develop pieces into the game, and you definitely wouldn't take twice on b5 because then bishop d7 comes, and we can see that black has 3 minor pieces out, white only has the queen out. Really big initiative for black, very bad position. So instead of playing like this, Shak played with bishop to g5 here, pinning this knight to the queen so that it can't immediately take on d5. And that's why Pragg follows up with queen to a5 check. And now that you've developed the bishop, you don't really want to be dropping it back to d2. So knight c3 came, and now b4 from Pragg. He kicks that knight back to d1 and captures on d5 here. So a crazy position, and white has to be careful now. If you get too casual and play bishop to g2, which looks really logical here to pick up this pawn, then bishop to e6 is a very powerful move. You've got all sorts of discovered issues going on here. You'd have to move the queen away or play bishop to h3, which is what Shak played in the game immediately. So he goes bishop to h3 here. Great move. And now Pragg really needed to keep these bishops on the board, especially because it hampers the development of the g1 knight, as we can see here. So knight d7 would have been a great move, keeping things interesting and tense. But instead of this, Pragg captured the bishop here. Not the best move, because now the knight can recapture, and after knight to d7, we can see that white's position is just a lot more harmonious. You can castle in one move, and there's some serious pressure coming in now against the e4 pawn and the centre in general. So rook to c1 came, hitting this pawn. We had h6 from Pragg. He kicks the bishop back to d2, defends the pawn with rook to c8, and now Shak goes pawn to f3. Really nice move. And there's a big threat already, which is just to take here, take control of the centre, and blow this knight back to a different square that isn't so powerful. So we had knight 7 to f6. Just briefly, you can't play f5 here. Well, you can, but after takes, castles, this is horrendous for black. You can't even get castled now. So that's why we didn't have f5. The knight came to f6. And now we had simply the knight dropping back into f2 from h3, renewing the threat of taking this pawn, and that's why black captured here. And now you don't recapture the pawn as white. Instead, you play pawn to e4, a really powerful domination of the centre here. You can always take this one back at your leisure at a later point. And this is a recurring theme in the position now, that Shak's in no rush to recapture that pawn. Instead, he wants an attack. Now, best here for Pragg would have been queen to b5, threatening mate in 1, and therefore forcing the queen to recapture this pawn, and now putting the knight on c7, not on b6 where it went in the game, because on c7, at least when e5 comes, which is what you want to play as white, you've got two knights looking at this d5 square, possibly this one could come to e6 later, a slightly better position for black than what we saw in the game. But from here, Pragg played knight into b6 instead, and after castles, bishop to e7, he now doesn't even take this pawn here, he goes knight to e3 immediately, and black's in big trouble because you can't even castle here or knight to f5 comes. There's big problems with this bishop. If you go bishop d8 or if you defend it with the rook, then you're coming in here like this. After capture's back, the pawn on b4 is dropping. This is the big problem, that this one's dropping off in any lines where the bishop moves or gets chopped off. So coming back here, that's why Pragg, instead of castling here, he played queen a4, desperate to get those queens off the board. Shak ducks out of it with queen to d3, but queen b5 renews this idea, and now Shak does go in for it. You could even play knight f5 here, very strong, but he chops off the queens, gives black this horrible pawn structure. The rooks swap off here, the knight recaptures, and pawn to e5. Again, just driving the black pieces back, and we can see the issues with the black position now with all these pieces stuck on the first two ranks and white dominating the centre. So knight to f5 came now. We had pawn to g6 kicking that knight, rook to c1 from Shak, so he hits this one if black were to take this knight. The knight came into b6 defending its brother, and now Shak just played really simply here. So he chopped the bishop on e7, we had knight recaptures, and he picked up this pawn on b4. He did have an option to win the h6 pawn instead, but he just goes for this line, and he's just keeping complete control in this position now with the dominating centre. So the knight came into d5 now, and again Shak just chooses a super simple line that keeps him with advantage, and he can see his way through here. So he chops on e7, the king recaptures, and the knight came into e4 here. So pawn to g5 from Pragg. He'd love to support this one on f3 if he possibly can, but h3 comes preventing that. And now Pragg tries a pawn break here. He should go pawn to f5 here, immediately attacking this knight, because after he goes pawn to f6, which he played in the game, he allows Shak to go rook to c5, hitting this knight and picking up a valuable tempo. And now there's issues, because if you play, say, rook to d8 to hold that knight, well, now we can take on f6. After the knight recaptures, there's rook to e5 check. You have to come to f7 here to hold on to the knight, and now we go rook f5. And if you take on d4, well, we take here, we've won a piece because of the pin, and white is just winning this position. We'll soon pick up on f3, and even though the black rook is slightly active, it's just not enough for the piece. So coming back to the position after rook to c5, that's why Pragg now goes pawn to f5, and so he should have done it in one tempo. The knight dropped back into d2, and now we had rook to d8 here. But the white knight can now pick up this pawn on f3, which has been vulnerable for much of the game, as we note. So pawn to b4 from Pragg, king to f2, knight to b6, so he opens up the rook here, but there's very little to do for black. It's really tough now. Rook to c6 from Shak. He's attacking this pawn. There's no good way to defend it, so Pragg goes for this rook to c8 move. Now you don't want to take here and let the black rook in with activity, so Shak simply chops, the knight recaptures, and he goes pawn to h4, breaking up this chain here. Now you'd love to play king to f6, but obviously that's not possible. So g4 kicks on, the knight comes back to e1, knight b6, knight g2, knight a4. So what we're seeing with this sequence of moves is that yes, Pragg is going to win some queenside pawns, but these ones here rumbling through the centre are just too much, supported by the knight coming into here and cleaning these ones up. So knight e3 came now, the knight took on b2, we had knight takes on f5 check, king e6, knight takes on h6, and knight d1 check, but now Shak just starts running the king over to the queen side here to blockade these ones if they ever got going. So we had knight c3 now, the knight took on g4, knight takes on a2, pawn h5, and knight c3 here. And the big problem for black, of course, is you can never march the king in because you're not even threatening to take here. Then this one would just be running. So king to d2 from Shak, knight e4 check, and king c2 was the final move of the game. To show you why Pragg resigned, I mean, say you take on g3, well, pawn h6 is just a killer. You can't actually get the knight back in time now, as we note, and if you come with the king, well then e6 check just finishes the game. Pick your poison here. If you take this one, this goes through. If you come this way, then this one goes through. Game over. If you enjoyed this video, then do hit here to subscribe to the channel and see more amazing Tata Steel games. Click here. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.